Hi, I'm Bronwyn Williams. You're back with the small print, and today my guest is William Gumede. As always on the show, William, we ask our guests to introduce themselves the way they would like to be introduced. So please tell our listeners and viewers who you are, what you do, and what you're passionate about.
Thank you, Bronwyn, and thank you for inviting me. I'm very happy to speak to you. My name is William Gumede, and I am Professor of Public Management at School of Governance at the University of Witwatersrand, and I'm founder and executive chairperson of the Democracy Works Foundation, which is now in 8 countries, certainly the largest democracy building, capacity building foundation in Africa. I've written very extensively about the BRICS countries, and also, predating the BRICS countries on IPSA, India, Brazil, South Africa alliance. People often forget that that was the early, potentially the first large developing country alliance across regions between Brazil, South Africa, and India, and it was pretty a unique alliance because it was also building democracy at the same time as trade. I wrote a book a couple of years ago on BRICS called South African BRICS, which was published by Tafelberg, and I'm just about to release an updated version.
Fantastic. And that's exactly why we invited you today. We wanted to have a conversation around BRICS, both the past and the future of the alliance. So perhaps we can start there. What were the original aims of setting up BRICS, both before South Africa joined and then when South Africa decided to join the project? So what is the origin story of this collection?
I mean, essentially, BRICS was created by China, Russia, India, Brazil at the beginning, to provide an alternative trade bloc to the Western nations. That really is the origin of it, and to have a developing country voice in the global market, in global political institutions, and in global financial institutions like the World Bank, the the World Trade Organization, and the United Nations. But essentially, it was a trade bloc of the world's largest emerging markets. China, India, Brazil, and Russia. Although Russia doesn't fit really as an emerging market because it's part of the old Soviet Union, and it at some point was an industrial country during the Soviet era. So that really was the start. South Africa joined later. Now, I don't think we can talk about BRICS without talking about IPSA also, because prior to BRICS, there was IPSA, India, Brazil, South Africa. And the idea then at the time was to create the largest developing country trade bloc across continents, but also at the same time to build democracies. And when BRICS was formed, led by China, it overtook IPSA, and although IPSA is still existing, it is now really almost just it's a much more smaller organization, and it is been overtaken by BRICS.
Now, that's a really interesting idea that we've covered on this show with various conversations with various different both economists and political analysts across the world, and how, at least in our Western liberal way of looking at the world, the idea was that democracy and growth, economic growth and progress went hand in hand. That was always kind of the idea, right? This was the whole American imperialism project that we still kind of seeing the effects of across the world. But the idea was, like you were saying, that strengthening democracy was good for progress in general. And by, as you said, bringing the likes of Russia and China into an organization that was first looking at both trade and democracy as being partners hand in hand, and then shifting that focus towards trade and growth without democracy really is kind of a big elephant in the liberal democratic discourse, right? And I think that if we look again, starting with the past, moving to the future of what's going on with BRICS and with the rumors of including the likes of Saudi and Iran within this organization, it's making more explicit this idea that perhaps it is possible, even if not desirable, to have economic progress without social progress. And the Saudi story, of course, is the classic example there, because they've been fantastic at growing economically, but without sort of having to care about things like human rights, which is so antithetical to the South African, at least, origin story, looking at the new South Africa and our constitution, which is so premised on social justice that economic justice kind of almost comes second, which we've had conversations about again on the show, whether that was a good balance and mix for South Africa or not. But I think that is the really uncomfortable question. Much like we have seen productivity growth decouple from like economic growth, productivity growth at a labor level. So in other words, contributions of individuals are no longer commiserate with success of the group, which of course reduces democracy. It reduces bargaining power for labor, for unions, and for citizens against the wealthy elites within their economies. That's a pretty big sort of split and schism that we've seen over the last few decades. The same thing is we've seen this idea of good people decoupling from the idea of sort of good economic progress. And I think that is a deep story. It's interwoven with the history of BRICS. And I think BRICS is a great vehicle with which to explore these very uncomfortable conversations. So I want to ask you two questions there. Firstly, saying, do you agree that this is an unspoken tension that's playing out, and that the success of the likes of Saudi and China are reinforcing that narrative? Firstly, so is the narrative something you'd agree with? But secondly, do you agree that that actually is true? Because often what is seen to be true, that what's symptomatic or what's true in the short term or what's revealed in the numbers now is not actually the bigger picture. And that perhaps there still is justification for saying that social and economic growth should go hand in hand, as the likes of Perth Toll, again, we've had on the show, that looked at the sort of economic freedom index as saying that growth and social progress should go together. So how would you answer those two parts to that question?
Let me start off with, obviously, my focus for the last 20 years is around the idea of democracy and development. That's why I set up Democracy Works Foundation, to provide the content to that argument in Africa. So in that context is that for Africa and for developing countries, democracy is absolutely critical. I mean, if I just bring you down to the African context in the post-Second World War era, there are 54 African countries recognized by the United Nations. The most successful countries, and there's just about 4 or 5, they've been economically successful based on democracy. Those who have said, because, in the early, after colonialism and immediate years of African independence, many African governments and leaders said, well, you can't have democracy and development together, and that democracy is it's an excess, it's a luxury. We have to go with development first. Now, all of the African countries that argued that route after independence, they all failed. State failure, state collapse, coups, ethnic violence. So they all failed. But the countries that focus on democracy and development in Africa, out of the 54 countries, Mauritius, Botswana, Cape Verde, for one period, Tunisia, they actually grew extraordinarily and became stable societies. So in Africa, there's not even an argument against democracy and development. I mean, it is clear. It's the evidence. 54 African countries, 40 or so African countries after the post-colonial period that argued that development cannot go with democracy. They've all failed. For me, there's no argument. Yeah? And I can say the same in many other developing countries. I'll take you to Brazil. Brazil, since the Second World War, it's the extraordinary growth levels of Brazil has always coincided with democratic periods, never during military rule or even during populist rule. So it's an extraordinary story for anyone, who wants to make the argument against democracy and development. Obviously, development can happen in any regime. Development happened during the Soviet Union, under communism, it happened. Development is happening, in China. Development is happening in Vietnam, and closer to home, and Rwanda. So all essentially what you need for development to happen is there has to be political will to do it. There has to be reasonable ability to deal with corruption, low levels of corruption. And then a country has to have a plan, and the country must stick to the plan, and the country must have a public service that is reasonably meritocratic. And then the country has to promote business, entrepreneurship. Absolutely entrepreneurship. I mean, we can see it in China. Yes, it is state-led capitalism, state capitalism, but they promote entrepreneurship in the state and also in the private sector. So if you have a combination of all of those things, whatever the regime, you can get development. So let me go back to BRICS then, in the context of this argument, development versus democracy. Now, what has happened in the last couple of years, because BRICS has actually swallowed IPSA. So we've seen the last couple of years almost a caucus, a democratic caucus in BRICS, where Brazil, South Africa, and India, they've been together, a caucus in BRICS. And now, I mean, this year in August, when there's the BRICS summit, will be the most extraordinary BRICS summit since it launched, or since South Africa joined as an additional member, because there is going to be a vote to increase the membership of BRICS, to make it a BRIC plus. So this makes it most probably one of the most significant political events in the post-war, post-Second World War era, because this is the first time where we have a developing country blocking, and we may actually have a significant number of countries joining BRICS. What does it mean for this democracy debate, development debate within BRICS itself? Now, for the first time, with the Democratic caucus in BRICS were actually the majority. The Brazil, India, South Africa so far. Now, once there's going to be entry of, for example, there are about 22 countries that applied, and it's Saudi Arabia, Argentina, Turkey, United Arab Emirates, so a whole range of countries that are non-democracies. So what it will do is, if there are many of these countries accepted, it will tilt the balance towards the non-democratic countries in BRICS. And so far it's been a delicate balance in BRICS between the democratic societies and the undemocratic societies, China and Russia, Brazil, South Africa, India. So when a new, possible entrance of a whole new group of countries, developing countries, I think will change that balance.
And what does that mean for the likes of South Africa, being now, as more countries join BRICS, obviously our power within the bloc, which was always a lot less than the other members, we were always a lot smaller than our partners in that project. What does it do for our position, our bargaining position in BRICS going forward, firstly? And then the second part to that question is, what does that bode towards South Africa's democratic future? Has BRICS, or at least the parts of it that were more democratic, being successful in democratizing its less democratic alliance members, or has it worked the other way, that in fact the likes and the power of China, which is just so outsizedly powerful within this particular group, has actually succeeded in perhaps deliberalizing some of its other peers within that bloc? What does it mean for the future of South African domestic as well as geopolitical politics?
Up to now, the BRICS alliance has been a trade alliance. Fully. So discussions of democracy, it was on a back burner because it was a trade alliance. Now, the Russia-Ukraine war has now shifted this trade alliance to get closer to a political alliance. Suddenly, it's not only trade, there's not only a focus on trade, but suddenly what we're seeing is now, BRICS countries are responding politically in support of Russia, politically, not from not as a trade. So we may see, if there's also an entry of new members, that it will become not only a trade alliance anymore, but a political alliance. So BRICS versus the G7, the group of industrial countries. So, so that's what's been happening. From a South Africa position, South Africa's influence in BRICS, because I think the original members of BRICS were always, the ways constructed in its foundation, pillars. The original members are always going to have more power than the new members. And then it's just how in all kinds of alliances, when one form alliance and the alliance has lasted for a long period, the original members, just by virtue of the past and legacy, will have more power. So it's not one shouldn't really talk about how much power South Africa will have, because the conversation should rather be different. So I think what people often don't understand about South Africa's position in BRICS is that South Africa is linked to the African Union, very close to the African Union. And I must explain, the African Union in the world. Now, there are 54 African countries who are part of the United Nations, so that's a third of the United Nations. So it's a bloc, if they vote together, it's a very influential bloc. Now, if you bring in, other countries with large, Black populations, Brazil, or you bring in sort of the Caribbean it brings the representations of Black or African-related representation in the United Nations over 50%. So they're the majority is a caucus already. So, for example, I'll just tell you from a practical point of view, if, say, for example, Russia lobbies them and they support Russia, whatever the West would introduce, whether it's sanctions in the WTO, in the UN, or in the World Bank, won't carry, because they are the majority. So South Africa is central in that grouping. In fact, is the leader in that grouping. And that's a very important thing that South Africans possibly don't understand, ordinary South Africans. That is why the West is engaging with South Africa in such a way. They can't cut off South Africa, because they would cut off a really big part of the world that is interlinked to South Africa. Obviously, the process of South Africa's interlinkedness started quite a long while ago, and it started, during the anti-apartheid struggle, which was a global struggle by developing countries behind South Africa. So that built up, that alliances from the past, and then, the pre-Cold War non-alignment movement, which the ANC was part of, all of those type of alignments has brought South Africa where it is now in its links with Africa and its links with the developing world. So it's quite a critical for us. Obviously, South Africans, South Africa is we have got inferior complexes relating to the world, relating to the West, and so on. But it's actually quite an important country still, despite our country being mismanaged by the ANC, and despite the fact that we are deindustrializing as a country, sadly, because of economic mismanagement by the governing ANC. The country is still an important country in the world, in the developing world. So even in BRICS, bringing in that Africa force makes the country punch above its own, let's call it maybe economic weight. And that really is how we have to look at South Africa.
So it's South Africa and friends is represented in the S in the BRICS at the moment. And we have quite an important role to play there. The question would be if we're playing a good role there, if we are the representation of the global South, of Black people across the world, of Africa in general in the UN, are we actually playing that role, or is it just a role that's kind of being cast upon us? Because I certainly don't, as a South African citizen, see South Africa's geopolitical strategy as being anything other than kind of what Russia or China says today. We've had some very humiliating moments where we've been absolutely called to heel by our big brothers in the BRICS group to make very bad choices around petty political issues where we've played that role. We've laid down and we've agreed to do what we shouldn't do for our own economic interests in the interests of our BRICS peers. So my question is, are we actually playing that role, or is that just a role that we happen to have inherited, but we don't necessarily know what to do with? And is that role secure, given that already, you know, depending on who you're looking at, or what data you're looking at, the likes of Nigeria overtaking us from an economic perspective, they've far overtaken us from population perspective. And is that a position that we're likely to retain, or does that really mean that we just need to play harder into our BRICS role, because that's an easier game to play than the game of actually leading the African responsibility, which I certainly haven't seen us doing. Maybe you disagree, but that doesn't seem to be a role that we've run with.
So, so let's start after 1994, when Mandela was the president. So, Mandela had a specific foreign policy. So his foreign policy was, and which theoretically was supposed to be, what the ANC was supposed to continue with. So what Mandela did was positioning South Africa as, the world's most diverse society. And we've got diasporas with India, Malaysia, Jewish diaspora, Muslim diaspora, and African and European, one of the most unique countries in the world, and Chinese, a large Chinese diaspora, as a country that would engage with all players in the world. That's the first. But also as a country that will fight not only on behalf of Africans, of other African countries, but on behalf of smaller developing countries. That is, if you look back at Mandela's foreign policy, that was absolutely key. Thabo Mbeki took over, and for him was an Africa project. He actually single-handedly, most probably, moved build the African Union. Before that, it was the Organization for African Unity, and he actually, the whole architecture, and then he created NEPAD, the New Partnership for Africa's Development, sort of a common economic policy for Africa, and sets up that structure. So, if you can see already, like South Africa's foreign policy role. Under the Zuma presidency, Zuma continued with the same kind of strategy, but it became something different. Also, something much more patronage. For example, in Africa, state capture. What is in for the people, for Zuma and the people around it. So a foreign policy, but linked to state capture also outside South Africa. For example, if South Africa is engaged with other African countries, their grouping around Zuma will also look for their own personal interests. Okay. Now, bring back where we are now. Where is our foreign policy? Right now in the world, the Russia-Ukraine war is defining every country's foreign policy at this moment. Yeah, it's now what is happening in the Russians have projected the Russia-Ukraine war as not a fight between Russia and Ukraine, but it's a fight between Russia and the West. So that is the way Russia has projected it in the Russia propaganda, Russia information. Many developing countries are anti the West, because people look at the West, at a developing country, an African country, as during the colonial period, the West did not support developing countries or African countries. So that defines the world still at present. So Russia's message to African countries, to many African countries, many developing countries, has been receptive of seeing the world as, or the Russia-Ukraine war as a war between Russia and the West, and Ukraine is just a proxy for that war. And that's now, what has it meant for South Africa? Or even before I get that, and Russia has also positioned itself in the world as saying that Russia is part of the global South, fighting the same things that developing countries are fighting: unfair global trade rules, unfair global politics, and all of those things that African countries and developing countries are struggling with. Right now, where is South Africa? And South Africa's engagement in this global politics, because the ANC is the governing party, the ANC is so dominant as a governing party, the ANC's foreign policy has been influencing South Africa's foreign policy. Yeah. So, and the ANC has an allegiance to Russia because of the Soviet Union support for the ANC in the liberation struggle. Obviously, Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union. Ukraine also supported the ANC's liberation struggle, or South Africa's, not the ANC's liberation struggle, but South Africa's liberation struggle. So obviously there's a hypocrisy immediately in the ANC supporting Russia based on the past. It should be supporting Ukraine also on the past, because Ukraine was part of that. Then there's another issue that the current generation of the leadership in the ANC, of the current leadership, most of them got their, or many of them rather, got their education in Russia. Or the former Soviet Union. In the 1980s, 1970s, 1960s, if you're Black South African, you couldn't study. There were many opportunities for people to study, whether engineering or maths and so on. And many of Black South African studies in Eastern Europe. And then there's another education of many of the current leadership is from the from 1948 onwards, all the way until the end of the Cold War. Every year, about 50 or so, or to 100 ANC leaders always went on training every year, leadership training in the Soviet Union, in Russia. So now you have to imagine every year from 1948 for a whole year, the elite of the ANC were chosen to go there. So the personal allegiances, everything comes from there. Also at the same time, and influences the current. And then there's the BRICS. Unfortunately, many ANC leaders, including President Ramaphosa, wrongly argued that because South Africa is part of BRICS, South Africa should support or should be neutral with Russia because of the BRICS, which is obviously not strategic, because a country like Brazil, that is also part of BRICS, is also critical of Russia at the same time, while it is part of the alliance. So what I'm saying is, it's a much more complicated relationship between South Africa, Russia, and the world.
Yes, and you're going back to that key point, which I wanted to get into a bit more now, that whole shift of being an economic trade alliance to being a political alliance, and actually an antagonistic bloc, not just a trade bloc that benefits trade for the members, something like the EU, but rather actually a bloc that negotiates or goes head to head with Western hegemony in various ways, on a political sphere, but also on a monetary economic sphere, which was also not originally part of the original sort of BRICS alliance. It was about trade, about making sure you have preferential trade partnerships and trade routes and buying and selling and all those good things. But moving ahead, there's been a lot of discourse over the last couple of years, and it's kind of come to a head over the last few months around this whole idea of a BRICS currency. So of course, rumors started around China and the yuan taking over from the dollar. Of course, my own perspectives there from an economic perspective is the dollar really is just like a colored, or the yuan really is just a colored dollar coin. I mean, the two currencies are so intertwined due to the sort of dual currency system China has and all the rest there. We don't need to go into that. But the point is, now there's been quite explicit conversations by quite prominent thought leaders, including our old stats general here in South Africa, have weighed in the conversation around BRICS having their own gold-backed currency, which is quite a right-wing economic perspective seen in the West. This idea of going back to the gold standard and rejecting the dollar is something that sort of right-wing radicals in the Western world have been pushing for quite some time. And that ball's been picked up now by BRICS in very explicit manner. What are your thoughts on that? Is it possible? Is it feasible? Or is the global economy just so intertwined that any such plans are actually just nothing but thought and not actually practical to roll out? And if it is practical, if you do think it is something that can be done, what is the wisdom of it? What would the BRICS bloc be giving up in order to be that much more protectionist around the currency side, the monetary side of the economy, not just the goods side? Because BRICS was about goods, then it was about politics, and now it's becoming about the sort of physical side of the economy too, which is another quite big jump. It's quite a big play towards independence from the dollar-based global world.
I think the first thing is, I think I have to just re-emphasize, we're actually in a new Cold War right now, where we are in the world. It's quite important to understand that. And it's an untraditional Cold War. There is a Cold War, a post-Cold War, Cold War between the West and now developing countries. And of course, Russia and China is actually pushing it even further to try to attempt to have the West, to intensify that post-Cold War, to have a situation of the West against the developing countries. So that is absolutely key. And my view, obviously, which I've expressed in books and very clearly, is that South Africa should actually position itself to engage with everyone, not to choose a camp in that new Cold War. Because we are uniquely diverse, and we have uniquely diverse networks and communities in South Africa with diverse, coming from diverse backgrounds, and we are uniquely positioned really to be part of both the West and developing countries. And that should be an important strategic foreign policy strategy for South Africa. Now, going back, to the BRICS currency. Now, the BRICS countries have set up a couple of new institutions to rival Western-dominated global institutions. The BRICS Bank, for example, is one of those institutions. Now, since its inception, the BRICS countries, BRICS strategy has been to try to find a counterbalance to the US dollar. So that has been from day one, since they launched BRICS. That was one of the strategies, and so on. Now, initially, it was not to replace the US dollar, but to bring in, other currencies as part of the global reserve pool. So not only the US dollar becomes, the dominant global reserve currency in the world, but other currencies also, so currencies from the developing world. So obviously the Chinese currency, the Chinese push for that, and the Indians push for their currency. So within BRICS from the start, there was the overall policy of, de-dollarizing the world, but not initially to replace it with another currency, but rather to bring in developing countries, as part of their package. I mean, even, as part of the debate, even outside BRICS, obviously countries like Japan and so on also made a similar argument to say, why can't the world also use the yen, for example, as an alternative? So there has been a debate, a really strong debate, since the end obviously of the Cold War, of how to reduce the US dollar's domination. And one of these arguments is really from practical point of view, because let's say in Brazil's case, is that for developing countries using the US dollar, it makes trade for them expensive, because say, for example, Brazil trades with Argentina, they use the US dollar. It's a third currency, so it makes trade. Yeah. So that's the first. The second thing, just in terms of the last couple of years, because the dollar is the global reserve currency. So when the US introduced monetary policy for its domestic monetary policy, it has spillovers in the world, and it destabilized emerging markets, economies. So there's been counter arguments to be made that because one way that the US should have dealt with this issue, because the dollar is so dominant, what the US should have done is in its domestic monetary policy to do it in coordination with other big economies, including industrial economies and developing country economies, so that they are not, the kind of destabilizing spillovers. And that is also why many emerging market countries actually want an alternative in order to prevent the destabilization of the economies by monetary policy changes in the US, and also obviously to some extent and in Europe. So that has been the big argument. Now, coming back again, from a BRICS point of view, over the last couple of years, many BRICS countries has began to trade more using their own currencies. Very slowly, not at a very big level. So, for example, Russia and China, for example, would use each other's currencies to some extent. Secondly, many, possibly 3 or 4 years ago, some of the BRIC countries began to buy in their foreign reserves, bring other currencies in there, not necessarily only BRICS country foreign reserves, but say the Swiss franc or the Australian dollar, diversify. They've been diversifying their foreign reserves.
Or Bitcoin if you're El Salvador, right?
Sorry?
Or Bitcoin if you're El Salvador, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously, in the last couple of years, on a Bitcoin side. Now, why has things changed why is there now a call for a BRICS currency? Because this thing is new.
And specifically a hard asset-backed currency, which is something that the West has clearly rejected, right? We've moved on to fiat economics. So both sides of that.
So it really is the principle. It's not necessarily. So I'm going to really broadly, why is this conversation? Because this conversation only came out after the Russia-Ukraine war.
Yes.
Before that, the debate was to bring in more to make BRICS currencies part of the global reserve pool. That was what the debate was. Russia-Ukraine war. Remember now, Russia under pressure began to push and say, well, actually, one way for Russia to circumvent sanctions is to de-dollarize the world and to begin to trade, to use its own currency more in the BRICS currency pool. China has been obviously trying to get its currency across in the world for a very, very long time without much success. Now, the Russia-Ukraine war has now provided opportunity for both Russia and China actually to begin to make a case now actually for a whole new currency.
Yes.
Yeah, but that is not necessarily the case for India, for example. I mean, India has been arguing not for a new BRICS currency. I mean, they were saying, well, actually, let's continue the old BRICS strategy of trading more with each other's currencies. So there is a split within BRICS over that. Yeah, so Russia, China wants to create a new BRICS currency, and it's all been fueled by the Russia-Ukraine war because, I mean, China has been watching the sanctions against Russia, and it is seeing what could happen to it if China, for example, invades, let's just say, Taiwan. The kind of the Western sanctions or economic warfare that the West has unleashed against Russia, they will do it against China also. So, and that is also one of the reasons why the Chinese are also now pushing for a BRICS currency. Their argument essentially is that a BRICS currency will make it very difficult for sanctions to be effective against any of the countries. Yeah.
Yeah, at least within the BRICS bloc, whoever is part of that would be, I think, effectively isolated. So you'd have a complete dichotomous world then.
Yeah. Now, in terms of the practicality of it, the first hurdle is that India is opposed to it. So it's a very, very big hurdle. Brazil has made a case for it. Lula da Silva, he returned to power in December. One of his objectives in the Brazilian presidency is to push for a BRICS currency. So he's now Brazil has joined Russia and China for a BRICS currency. Now, what is the practicality of it? Now, if you look at other currency blocks, this has been successful. I mean, normally the currency blocks are successful, like the European Union. The euro has been successful because they, closed geographical area. The institutions are similar. They have a central bank and monetary policy that are similar, and so on. The difficulties for a BRICS currency area is we are geographically apart. Secondly, is the monetary regimes in the countries are very, very different. The Chinese and Russia are state-owned central banks. Brazil, South Africa, and India, independent central banks. So, the third of the real difficulty is in terms of that the Chinese essentially wants to use its currency to be the dominant currency. So essentially what the Chinese want to do is the BRICS countries should actually be the Chinese currency, essentially. That's if you read the fine print. Will India allow that? I don't think so. The Russians mostly will be very keen about it because they are in economic trouble. There will be a way out for them. So BRICS currently, and then maybe fourthly, in terms of the BRICS countries don't have a big enough trade volume among themselves to create a united monetary policy pool. So these are the things that really goes from a practical point of view goes against it. Now it could change because the BRICS trading bloc doesn't have an optimum, what we call in economics, an optimum currency area. The optimum currency area really to make a common currency possible is the trade volume. And so on. Now, if, for example, the oil producing countries join BRICS, that may change the game because, the US dollar, really the hegemony of the US dollar is because it's a petrodollar, is that oil transactions, are traded with the US dollar. Now, if that group of countries, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Venezuela, and so on, if they join, and even Nigeria, Egypt, and so on, if they join and they all have applied, join the BRICS, it will then increase the optimum currency area and it will bring the petrodollar into the BRICS, and then that could help with, for example, the success of a BRICS currency. So that will be a game changer in terms of how many of the petrodollar countries actually join the BRICS zone.
Join the BRICS zone, but not just for the trade bloc, for the monetary trade bloc.
Yeah,
and that's perhaps a separate question. I suppose that would be something that I would like to ask you, but I understand if you don't have answers there, is that what are the likelihoods of these new countries? Which countries do you expect will join BRICS in the next round, if any? And how deeply will they join? Will they be joining just for the goods market, or for the goods and political market, or for the goods and political and monetary market, in your opinion? Of course, I am asking you to look ahead, which is always unfair, but I'm interested to hear your thoughts.
22 countries have already applied, right? And some countries obviously apply for political reasons, like Iran, which applied for political reasons, because BRICS will be a safety space for them. Cuba has applied again for political reasons because it's under pressure from the US. So there's a political group of countries that join for political, and then there's also other countries that join on the economic side. So a lot of the oil producing countries are actually joining because of the economics of these, and also to get out of the US-led global economic system. So that's key. So we've got different type of countries, and then sort of a third level of countries are joining because they want to be part of the new world order that they think is coming, because they think that there will be a BRICS-led new world order, and they want to be part of that. So many African countries, for example, want to join on that basis, and so on. So different levels of countries wanting to join. Say, for example, similar like Indonesia, want to be part of its in their context. Mexico has applied to join because it wants to get out of the power zone of the US. Argentina has joined again also because he also wants to get out of the power. And I think most probably Argentina much more on the economic side. I mean, it's been an economic crisis country, and it thinks, so some countries are also joining, they are in economic crisis, and I think a BRICS route will help them get out of the economic crisis. Now, the difficulty of the decision is the BRICS countries are still debating how, what would be the criteria of admitting countries. So there's no consensus.
Do we want Argentina if it can't pay its bills? I mean, like,
yeah, absolutely. So there's no consensus, And then there are countries like India, for example, that would prefer a smaller BRICS.
Yes.
But then there's China and Russia, obviously, for their own reasons, who want a bigger BRICS because that will make, will increase their power against G7. So all of these things are all unresolved.
Okay, so that was a fair answer to an unfair question. And I do know that you need to go quite soon. So I want to give you one last opportunity to clarify anything, tie together any loose threads, or make any general comments about the future of BRICS and what it means, particularly for South Africans and for South African citizens. Are there any things that we haven't covered today that South African citizens should consider very carefully as we move into our next election cycle, as we engage with our political leaders? What are the questions civil society should be asking around BRICS, our involvement in it from a really South Africa first perspective?
I think, remember, there is still the element in the room of next year's national elections. The ANC may lose the elections and not be in power next year. So then we will come back with a totally different conversation. For example, would the a DA-led opposition, for example, still continue in BRICS? Or would we, if the opposition come to power at the national level, will we remain in a Commonwealth and be hands off in BRICS, or would we be part of BRICS but in a less active the way, almost like Brazil played in the previous before Lula. They were part of BRICS but not really enthusiastic about BRICS, so they were really hands off. And so on. So, so all of that, so everything is still uncertain. Obviously, if the ANC returns to power with a majority, they will continue on this path that they're continuing, but that is not guaranteed. The ANC may actually be in power only with a coalition also, and then they will have to consult with its coalition. And South Africa's strategy towards BRICS may be totally different. But one of the things that I wanted to say that I maybe didn't talk about a little bit more is that actually what we'll see after the Russia-Ukraine war, the new phenomenon that's been happening in relation to currencies, there's been a rise in regional currency blocks. And I think that phenomenon will increase. So I know we think about the debate about a BRICS currency, but there's also other currency blocks has come out now. I mean, Brazil and Argentina, for example, are putting together their own sort of a currency pool. How that effective that's going to be, obviously it's a different story. In Africa, there's been a change, but the Francophone Africa currency pool. I mean, there's they are moving out of they're delinking from France and from the euro to create something totally different. So there are a whole lot of. It's the de-dollarization of the world is happening, but it's happening in a diversified way. There are new currency blocks happening. The US dollar, the power of the US dollar less and less. But the US dollar cannot be. The US dollar will be with us for a very, very long time. So no other currency right now in the world will be able to replace the US dollar immediately. I mean, I'm just thinking when a US dollar replaced the British pound, it took about 50 years, half a century. So to replace, and that's how we have to look at, to replace the US dollar as the dominant currency of the world, most probably will take upwards to 25 years and more. So it's not going to be displaced because I mean the other thing that I say in terms of the weakness of a currency or some of the challenges of getting a BRICS currency is that the magic of the US dollar is underpinned by very strong institutions and very credible institutions, both democratic institutions, but also monetary institutions, and with trust, global trust. So despite the criticism, there's a trust with it. And if you look at the BRICS countries, they don't have the strong and deep institutions. They are, all the BRICS countries right now are structurally unstable. Russia in its war with Ukraine the country is structurally unstable, both economically and politically. China is structurally unstable because it's a communist party run, it's a dominant regime. We don't know how long that regime will last. China may be in a war in the next few months, against Taiwan. So it's structurally weak. It doesn't have the depth. Brazil right now, I mean, it faces massive economic problems. I don't think Lula will have the same smoothness of his first term, because right now Brazil is so divided. It's very, very difficult. And of course, South Africa, I mean, we are deindustrializing as an economy. So from their point of view, if to build a currency, you need to have very strong institutions and stability, and the US dollar has that, which we don't have in BRICS.
I get what you're saying. I mean, like, the US dollar is unfair. It's unfairly skewed towards the USA and away from everyone else, but it's a known unfairness. And when it comes to investment and development, generally what investors want is known risk and known cost, and you work around that, right? So that's certainly we can't give. But is that not why the conversation has shifted around from a BRICS currency that's a pool of the currencies within the bloc towards the hard currency question, which was something, as I said, that was the domain of conspiracy theorists and right-wing libertarians for a very long time. But this idea of a gold-backed currency does have more credibility than any of those independent currencies. But that, again, comes with a huge set of challenges.
Totally. Remember now, in terms of, I think from a practical point of view, the BRICS alliance will sit down and say, well, actually, most probably, I hope they will get advice, well, that it's not practical in the old form of currencies, but then they will look at alternatives, gold back, for example, or they will look at digital currencies. They look at increasing trade in their own currencies among themselves, and so on. So they will look at alternatives. So we may not see immediately in the short term a BRICS currency, but we'll see alternative types of currencies and ways to trade, in the short term.
This conversation is not over. I look forward to picking it up with you when we see where the chips lie at the end of our next year's election, which no one knows, because no one knows what the young people are going to do. Are they going to vote? Are they not going to vote? Who are they going to vote for if they do vote?
Oh, please let them vote, because we need change.
Yeah, please vote. We would like you to vote, but the problem is with this generation is because they haven't voted in the last 2 election cycles. It's like the class that came into work in offices post lockdown. They're all arriving all at once, and none of our polls can make any sort of prediction about what they're going to do. So we need to encourage them to vote, but also hopefully nudge them towards choosing well.
The right parties, right? Like not to repeat, like not to bring the same people in.
Interesting times. It's been great speaking to you. I do want to let you go and carry on with your day. I know you've got lots of things to get onto. But before I let you go, one last question. If people want to find you, want to work with you, want to ask you questions, interview you further, where can they get hold of you? Otherwise, thank you so much for joining me.
Absolutely. I'm at WITS, and I'm William.Gumede at wits.ac.za, or I'm at Democracy Works, info at Democracy Works Foundation for work.org.
Thank you so much, William.
Okay, thank you.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and rate us on all your preferred podcast platforms. If you'd like to find out more about what we're doing, please join our Substack community via the link in the comments below. And as always, we'd love to hear your suggestions for future guests and conversation topics.